Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. As you can see, and you'll hear in a moment, it is all hands on deck from the start here on this episode. Mark Brennan, Daniel Gallen with me. We've got a lot to cover between now and Saturday noon kickoff in Columbus. These guys will be out there. 24/7 sports coverage has been fantastic leading up to this one. It will continue that way. It hasn't just been us here at the local level. There's also been a ton of national coverage. Chris Hummer weighed in with a story, a nice topical story today on Ohio State versus Penn State and the Nittany Lions trying to close that gap. Our good friend Josh Pate will be making the trip to Columbus to help set the stage for this one on Saturday as well. So a lot coming your way, but here on our Thursday podcast, we do our best to try to get things everything that we kind of have in our notebook out in the open. And that starts with that Wednesday night look at Penn State practice, Wednesday evening. We had a chance to see that. And fellas, we saw JB Nelson out there, not only out there, but participating and the first left guard involved. Mark, to be able to bring this kind of offensive line on the road, Phil Trautwein had two separate groups of 5 men operating in tandem, working in sync against 2 different scout team looks. It was the first team offensive line that appeared to feature JB Nelson when we watched it, and then the second team offensive line. To be able to be in this position mid-season, going on the road, you think about where they were last year, down 2 starters, banged up elsewhere, would eventually be without Olu Fashanu by the time that game ended. This feels like a very, very notable development midweek.
Yeah, it obviously stinks that Landon Tangwell, had to hang up, his cleats. But we talked early in the season about the depth of this team. And we talked about it earlier this week when we weren't sure if we would see JB Nelson and about how this is where it really pays off. Well, now not only is it paying off, Tyler, but you're in a situation where, you have JB Nelson coming back from injury, but now you have Vega Ioane, who's played a ton of snaps the last couple games. And now you have Nick Dawkins, who was able to rep at both guard spots. So what was already a very deep position, and again, it stinks that you lose a kid, due to injury, had to hang it up for his career. But now all of a sudden it looks even deeper. And listen, I don't think we have to look too far into last season's game to see what a difference the banged up offensive line had to do. I mean, I was looking through photos and was it Bryce Effner who was out there? I mean, I forget, was it that last year 2 years? Well, regardless, you need to be in as good a position as you could be in against this caliber of opponent with this caliber of defensive line and this caliber of defensive linemen. And I think that they are. I think they're in a really good spot.
Sorry to cut you off there. I was just going to say Daniel kind of did a nice job when he was on the call with Olu today or earlier this week and laid that out for our Lions247 subscribers of kind of where that offensive line was, where Olu was last year in that Ohio State game. And it is a stark contrast. I mean, no disrespect to where Bryce Effner ended up by season's end last year. He was a very important piece of the puzzle for them during that win streak. Started at right tackle for the final 5 games, but he was thrown into the fire in a significant way and feasted upon in a significant way as well. And then you had Hunter Norzad banged up playing some left guard as well. And as we mentioned, Olu himself is an observer by the time this one ends. And so, Daniel, take us back to that spot just a little bit and then share your thoughts on what they're taking to Columbus up front.
I mean, it's very stark, how different this offensive line looks this year as opposed to last year. And I think on top of it, you also have to factor in the level that some of these players are playing at. It's not just that you have Caden Wallace at right tackle instead of Bryce Effner. It's that you have Caden Wallace playing at an improved and much better level. I thought on the message boards earlier Thursday, Tyler, you answered a question from someone about how Caden Wallace was performing this year and did a very nice job of kind of laying things out with an assist from Pro Football Focus. But I think that when you look at, what this offensive line was last year, I think that, James Franklin going into the 2022 season, he said, I'm going to stop talking about the offensive line. They have to prove it. When we were at this point, I think that was October 29th, I believe, last year, the offensive line hadn't proven it yet, going into that Ohio State game. And I think that, coming out of it, you had a lot of questions just because you let one player get loose in just a couple crucial junctures, and really change the complexion and change the outcome of that game. And so, I think by the end of the year, I think that offensive line had really proven itself. You saw guys, I think, really, really develop, especially once Hunter Norzad got healthy down the stretch. Sal Wormley spent a lot of time out there. Bryce Effner was solid by the end of the year. And then you got Caden Wallace back in the Rose Bowl, not to mention Drew Shelton, really holding it down in a tough spot on the left side. And of course, Drew Scruggs kind of serving as the linchpin at center of all of that. But I think that, at this point in the season last year, you still had some questions. You were still kind of waiting to see, if the offensive line could hold up, against an opponent of Ohio State's caliber. And I think where Penn State is going into the game this year, it's very stark. And I think a big thing is just the amount of experience that they have, the amount of reps that these guys have gotten both down the stretch last year and early in the season. And then on top of that, the reps that the depth has gotten. James Franklin said that, Vanga Ioane is still going to play at guard. We saw them, use that rotation with Nick Dawkins. And I think that, we've talked a lot about kind of the hierarchy of the offensive line. And, maybe in the preseason, Nick Dawkins was kind of below that cutoff of the top, however we do it. But I think he's moved himself up into that. So, I think that they're very deep, and they're, very ready, I think, for this challenge on Saturday.
They will tell you they have 7 starters. That includes Shelton, that includes Ioane. And now I think that they have this fringe kind of guy now with Nick Dawkins, who, because of the reps that he's been able to accrue through the first half of the season, because of the makeup he has, also they recruited him for a reason. It's just taking some time because one reason or another. He's in year 4 now, where he's a viable option. So for you to be able to go down the list of 8 names at this stage of the season without even have to enter freshman territory. And by the way, 3 of these freshmen, Chim Diono, Javen Williams, Anthony Donka, they have all each played more snaps to this point in the season than Drew Shelton had played to that point in the 2022 season. And he ended up starting 5 games. So to Mark's point, you're getting seasoning for some of these guys because you're maximizing the situation. You're missing out on starters, but you're feeding a lot of reps to players. And something else you guys said that I think really stands out is, Caden Wallace, I think people are accustomed to him in the Big Ten. They think they've got him figured out. Probably a lot of Penn State fans still feel like they have him figured out. Thus far, the 6-game sample size, you can't really argue with the improvements, whether it's anecdotally with the conversations we've had with people at Penn State's facilities, really going back to when he showed up for winter workouts with the mindset he had, but carrying over into preseason camp and through these 6 matchups, the physicality improvements and really his pass blocking abilities. But none of us are going to put firmly 2 feet on that bandwagon of Caden Wallace having arrived until he gets through these 60 minutes of football, right, guys? I mean, it's just one of those spotlight players here in the matchup, and we'll get to our players of the game later, our players to watch later. And I think I was going to go with Caden Wallace, but I guess I might as well figure someone else out. Just feels like that spotlight's on him. It's a prove it moment, maybe as much as for anybody on this roster. And it's just, Mark, that's one of the themes here through Game 6 as we look ahead to this matchup is how much can you trust from a 6-0 start? Can you trust that Caden Wallace has taken this significant step forward? Can you trust that the offensive line isn't going to be giving up sacks in bunches now that the Big Ten test gets tougher? Or, is this something that starts to fade away a little bit and the 6-0 magic, as you get deeper into the season and you look in the rearview mirror and you say, well, that was a little bit fool's gold. We can't answer that now, but I think it's fascinating.
Well, yeah, and maybe some people don't want to hear it, but when you lose 6 straight games to a team, it's kind of like show me in all facets. I mean, not just in what we're talking about. I mean, it's, you've proven that you can't quite get over that hump. You've been very close at times, but do you have what it takes to get to that next level? I will say this, that I don't know that this schedule could have played out better for Penn State in terms of keeping guys healthy, keeping them fresh, limiting snaps. I know I'll go back to what I said earlier in the week when, last week somebody said to me, and if you missed a pod earlier in the week, do you think it's going to be an advantage for Ohio State that they've played in a close game or a couple close games if you throw Indiana in there, or parts of the Maryland game were relatively close? And I said, well, geez, Penn State was in close games prior to the Ohio Ohio State games the last 6 years, and it didn't seem to help them in any of those. So I don't know. For me, if I'm the coach, I would rather be fresh. I would rather be deep. I would rather have been able to get all these different players, all these snaps on the road to 6-0, and then you're able to get that bye weekend at kind of a perfect time to let everybody take a step back and self-scout, self-analyze, and then you come out with what was basically a scrimmage against UMass. And listen, everybody's playing those games. I don't think anybody has to apologize for that. But I think the way this has played out has been really good for Penn State. We're talking about a guy like Caden Wallace, but I would also say Harrison Wallace. I mean, there's a situation where he was able to come back and knock some rust off and play 50 snaps according to your rundown. I mean, yeah, sure, he had a fumble, but much better to have that against UMass than to have it in the horseshoe, right? So maybe get that out of your system. But I think that's just another area where we talk about the health of this team. And again, knock on wood for Penn State and every team that they all stay healthy. But going into this one, it looks like Penn State does have an advantage in overall team health.
And Khalil Dinkins was back at practice. He was not available for the last game, listed as out in the pregame availability report. That meant a lot of work comparatively for Andrew Rapplier as the third tight end in that matchup. We think Rapplier is going to still stay the redshirt course if Dinkins is available. It looks like that will be the case. And Dinkins has been utilizing those 3 tight end sets on short yardage situations where you're going to see Drew Aller pretty much run the football or get pushed over the line of scrimmage. Daniel, Mark referenced the health. We've talked about it. Good news for the offense that you get Harrison Wallace back in the fold. He certainly, I thought, looked the part in having that trust rapport with Drew Aller again. That's what we saw early in September. And then we just talked about what you're getting back with JB Nelson, how that changes things for the offensive line. But it's not really just about the injuries. It's about the mileage they avoided along the way because of all these blowout wins. And all these defenders will tell you how fresh they're feeling. And then the question from the Warriors out there and from some of us in the media out there is, well, what does it look like when they've got to play 4 full quarters, and that pressure's on? No one seems concerned about it in Penn State facilities. They think that this team will be up to the task. And Curtis Jacobs says they're always prepared if they play 4 quarters. They'd prefer to do it if they could, but then the coaches say, come to the sideline. They call the dogs off. What do you make of the defense now that it's go time here and that they're going to have to, we'd imagine, go all the way in Columbus?
Well, that's what your off-season conditioning is for, and your off-season workouts. I think over the summer, that's where you really put in the work to get to the point where you're able to play 4 quarters. So I don't really have any worry about this defense, having to be, in that situation. And even if they were to play, have to go wire to wire with what is ostensibly the first team. I mean, there's so much rotating that happens, just to begin with. You see, like, you'll finish a game and Keziah Izzard and Devon Elise are the top rep getters at defensive tackle, and they didn't start. We've seen all the different combinations that Manny Diaz uses at linebacker. We've seen what Terry Smith and Anthony Poindexter have done in the secondary, with getting guys in and out. And so, this is going to be a wire to wire game. James Franklin said last night that he expects it to be a 1-possession game. Just because of where the talent levels are and, the stakes of the game. And, so we're going to see those guys play a lot of snaps, but, I think that they're ready. I mean, a lot of these guys, they've gone wire to wire last year. They know what it takes. They know what they need to do to go all 4 quarters. And I think the fact that they haven't been, they haven't been used a lot this year, I think it's going to help. I mean, they're fresh. It kind of goes into that thing with, like Mark mentioned, where, not seeing them in a close game, does that make you think that, they can handle a close game? It's like, not seeing them go 4 quarters. Does that make you think that they can't go 4 quarters? I think that they can, because, that's the type of athlete that Penn State recruits. That's the work that they put in the off season, with those conditioning programs and with those workouts. So, I think that the way that these first couple of weeks have gone is going to serve this defense very, very well, because, not only are they probably going to have to go 4 quarters against Ohio State, it's going to be 4 quarters chasing around a bunch of 4- and 5-star athletes on that field with the offense that Ryan Day and Brian Hartline have. So, I think that Penn State's ready. I think that this is a game that they've definitely had circled on the calendar since the beginning of the season. I think it's one that has probably been really circled for the past 3 or 4 weeks when you consider going Northwestern, bye week, UMass on the schedule. So, I think they're champing at the bit to get out there. And, when it's time to go, they're going to be able to go and sustain it.
The individual statistics defensively for Penn State are extremely bizarre. Curtis Jacobs is the only guy over 20 tackles at this point. I think Iowa's leading tackler in that matchup still had about as many tackles as Curtis Jacobs has on the season through 6 games. But they've got 15 guys, I think the number is, with 10-plus tackles. And whoever has been on the field, the standard has been upheld. I think that's what James Franklin references a lot when they really evaluate these games that are 63-0. They try to nitpick. It's what happens toward the end of those games. And the comprehensive work that this defense has put in, number 1 in the Big Ten in sacks, number 1 in the Big Ten in rush defense, number 1 in the Big Ten in pass defense, number 1 in the Big Ten in total defense, 193 yards per game surrendered, which is 40 yards better than the next team up at Michigan. And things are going to get a whole lot different here on the road in Columbus, but we expect the defense to hold up in its end of the bargain, Manny Diaz to go deep. And the part of it is, how much does Diaz play the role here, Mark? James Franklin hit a home run. I think there's no doubt about it at this point based on a season and a half and bringing in the former Miami Hurricanes head coach. But it feels like every time we've talked to Diaz about this defense, and we did so during the bye week, anytime we talk to the players about, hey, what haven't we seen yet? What aren't we, what lies ahead here, the new wrinkles, there's a bit of a smirk involved, and I'm curious to see if that curtain gets pulled back a bit, because this is the time to do it. Let's not really, aside from the fact that it's a national showcase game and there's a very small margin of error, you've also got a first-year starting quarterback who, he's played at Notre Dame, but he's still racking up his early tests in his career as well.
Yeah, I read something from Heather Dinich on ESPN today that I thought was pretty interesting. She's a very good reporter. Actually worked for the CDT for a time and covered Penn State, but she had a chance to talk to Manny. Was it her or Rittenberg? Regardless, one of them talked to Manny, and one of the points that he made is that one of the real keys against playing a team this good is that not to let them know where you're coming from. I mean, and what have we seen from this Penn State defense when it comes to pressuring the quarterback? You know who's going to be getting after the quarterback. I mean, Cam Miller had 2 sacks in the game, right? So you have a backup quarterback with 2 sacks in the game. And was it 2 sacks?
First time in 31 years, Mark. First time in 31 years a defensive back has had 2 sacks in a game.
So you're putting that on tape. I mean, and I know that's kind of cliche. You're putting something on tape, but when you're the offensive brain trust at Ohio State, you have to really pay attention to that. And don't forget, you have a first-year starting quarterback there, another guy who's played extremely well. But those are the things that I think in year 2 under Manny Diaz, we're starting to see more of these different options. I mean, we saw a little bit of that 3 defensive end stuff last year, but we're seeing much more of it. They started the last game in nickel. I mean, you don't know what you're going to get from play 1 to the last play of the game. The 2 guys that I would really keep an eye on, though, because I think they could be tested with respect to the number of snaps they're going to see, are Curtis Jacobs and Abdul Carter. I think they are so important at those positions, and Abdul being able to play kind of that Mike and the Prowler and whatnot, as well as the other spot. But I just think they're so important, and I'm not questioning their fitness, because I'm sure these guys are extremely fit, but they haven't played a ton of snaps, and I could see both of those guys being asked to play 60 snaps or something crazy in this game, just because those 2 spots. And that's no offense to Dom DeLuca or Rojas or anybody else. I just think that those guys are at a little bit different level, and when you're playing some of those specialty packages, they're just the guys who aren't quite as replaceable to me as some of the other people. And that may be coming across wrong. I don't mean anybody's, replaceable. These guys were all valuable players, but in terms of what they kind of bring to the table, and they've been fortunate enough to limit them in most games, but I think you could see those 2 guys taking a gigantic boost in snaps this week.
I feel like your base defense is Abdul Carter, Curtis Jacobs, Daquan Hardy, Kalen King, Johnny Dixon. There's going to be 6 moving pieces around those, but those 5 guys in my mind in this matchup Probably not going to be leaving the field very often. We'll see if Daquan Hardy does some damage as a punt returner too. That's something we'll get into a little bit later here. But defensively, let's put that aside for now. We'll review it in the post game and see how it came out the other side. But offensively, a big conversation piece this week nationally is a lot of people directing their attention towards Drew Aller. And you figured that would be the case if Penn State got here to 6-0 and he was playing good football and he was going home to Ohio, that this would be a national, buzzy kind of topic. And it has been here for Drew Aller. And I know James Franklin is doing his best to make sure they're circling the wagons and having this kind of an incubated environment for their quarterback, preparing for this big test. But I got to say, this just doesn't feel like they're taking a kid quarterback to Columbus, Daniel. I mean, that was part of the questions we all had, I think, in August, is what kind of a Drew Aller will we see? And when you see the numbers, 15 total touchdowns, no interceptions, that looks great. But it's a lot of the stuff that doesn't reflect in the box score, the body language, the throwaways. I guess that's reflected in the incompletion. But, I mean, everything that we have seen and heard about in terms of his ball security and decision-making and that ability to move the passing pocket. I think you've got to attribute some of that success in allowing the fewest sacks in the Big Ten to his ability to manipulate the pocket and avoid some of those things where another quarterback might crumple, might get brought down. So with number 15 in there, I know you've written at least one story this week. I don't know if you've got another one brewing for us at Lions247.com, but what's your take on where he stands heading home?
Yeah, I think when you look at Drew Aller this year, the intangibles obviously are off the charts, and I think that what you brought up in terms of the pocket movement, the throwaways, that's not quite intangibles. I guess that's more less tangible stuff because that also doesn't really come through on the stat sheet. That's just been very solid. I mean, I think that he goes to Columbus as a quarterback with just a very, very solid floor. And I think that, he has his 2 road starts have been, not his best. Against Illinois and Northwestern, he didn't exactly light it up. But at the same time, he didn't make any backbreaking mistakes, and he had Penn State, in the position to win, and win handily. So I think he goes back to Ohio just in a very, very good position. Talking to him this week, he seemed very, very locked in with everything that he said. I think that he did a good job, of redirecting a lot of the questions about going home to Ohio and what that would mean to him, and some stuff about his recruitment with regards to Ohio State, and he did a good job of redirecting it back to what he needed to. But at the same time, I think that he knows that this game is a little bit different. He knows that there's stakes, and he acknowledged that a little bit. He talked about the group chat with some of his high school friends and teammates, going off this week, and those sorts of things. So I think he's aware, and I honestly think that's good. I think we heard that from a couple players this week. Kalen King said it last night. Nick Singleton said that he's excited to play in this type of game. I think that there's kind of the unspoken thing where I think actually Drew Aller said this, where it's, guys go to Penn State to play in games like these, guys go to Ohio State to play in games like these. I think that there's a lot of excitement around it. And I think that, we talk a lot about 1-0, but I think sometimes it's good to acknowledge that, this isn't UMass, this isn't Delaware, this isn't even Iowa, this is Ohio State. There's a lot at stake right now. But going back to Drew Aller, I mean, I think that he just seems very in control with everything that he does. He never really seems to get sped up. I think that's really going to be tested against this Ohio State defense on Saturday because of some of the talent and some of the athletes. But we're going to come out of Saturday just knowing so much more about him as a quarterback in either direction. And he also strikes me as the type of player that, even if this is a loss, I think that there will still probably be things that we come out with, feeling better about him and knowing more about him. But, I think that there's going to be a lot of eyes on him. I think I said it on a pod earlier this week, watching the Fox NFL games over the weekend and the promo for Big Noon Saturday. It's a lot of Drew Aller. And I think a lot of people are going to get the opportunity to get introduced to him and really learn a lot about him, including us.
And with the native son narrative this week, you'd think that Penn State wasn't sending out an Ohio native at quarterback the last 4 times these teams met. But of course, the big difference there was Sean Clifford was not the number 1 quarterback recruit in the country. And
Sean was also born in
Aller,
Illinois, as he would
well,
tell you.
well, Drew Aller, Mr. Ohio football, as we all know. And if they pull this off and he ends up coming home with a win, and getting out of Ohio Stadium at 7-0 as a starting quarterback for the Nittany Lions, everyone can redirect a little bit of that joy on Saturday toward Quinn Ewers, because he basically threw a grenade in Ohio State's quarterback plans. They had such a good thing going for years where they could rotate. And I don't want to shortchange what Kyle McCord is or can be for them. And we'll learn a lot more about him against this Penn State defense Saturday. But Quinn Ewers has looked the part at Texas for the most part, and he was the number 1 quarterback recruit in the country. Supposed to be the guy before Drew Aller's a year. He reclassifies. It was a really interesting thing. He ends up preceding Aller to campus and leaving before really Aller even takes off as a recruit. So we'll make sense of all that down the road. This won't be his first go round against the Buckeyes, I don't think, but it's a big part of the conversation here. And another part of the conversation, Mark, is the offensive identity. Now we know more about this quarterback week by week, but we're starting to get a feel for, I think, where the rapport is. Harrison Wallace is back. You see it pick up right back from the jump with them last week. Keandre Labor-Smith has been his dialed up guy when it matters the most. Theo Johnson starting to gain some momentum of late. Tyler Warren's been a target throughout. So you've got the foursome of guys that it feels like he has the comfort level with, and he's growing that week by week. What do you make of the offensive identity and how the ground game fits in?
Well, they've committed to the ground game, which is what I like. I mean, even though it hasn't produced the explosive plays that I think a lot of people would have hoped at this point, but as it stands, they're leading the Big Ten in rushing yards per game, and I think overall carries. So, I think Mike Yurcich has been smart enough to realize that if you're going to win some of these big games, that ground game is going to have to come into play. I still, last week, I was really looking for more flashes from Nick Singleton, and I just don't think we've seen it. And even with Katron, I thought more of his he's always been that tough physical runner. But to me, that was more, rugby piles moving down the field, and I don't know that that's going to work against this particular team. So I think they just have to stay true to what they've been doing, and hope that at some point you're going to pop a longer run or two. We've seen it from Singleton. We know that it's there. We've seen Penn State backs do it at Ohio State or against Ohio State. So I just think I think that part is important, but I do think we will see. I think we're going to see more, not complicated. I think some of the deep shots they take in this game may be some of the things they've been keeping in their back pocket, and rightfully so. So does that maybe loosen things up and give you an opportunity to break a couple more of those long runs? But I do, as I look at this team, 2 weeks ago, the biggest question mark to me was special teams. But now I still think the biggest question mark is this team going to be able to go out in a 4-minute drill and chew up clock and just pound the ball down another team's throat? And I just don't know that we could confidently say that at this point. I'll be more than happy if they prove me wrong and say, yeah, look what happened. But I don't know that anybody could confidently say that at this point. And again, I just don't think Nick Singleton has looked like the back he was last year. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe just has to let the game come to him. But this is going to be an opportunity. I mean, I'm pretty sure he's going to be playing in the fourth quarter of this game. If he's not, it's either going to be really bad or really good. But if he and Katron Allen get their opportunities in the fourth quarter, let's see if maybe that's where they could break it long, because the opposing defense is a little tired.
14 total fourth quarter carries for that tandem through the first 6 games of this season. A different look, you'd imagine, on Saturday. And look, you think about these running backs going up against Ohio State's linebackers, and it's been a big year of improvement for the most part for this Buckeyes defense after some embarrassing moments the last couple of seasons late. We heard a lot of love from James Franklin about Tommy Eichenberg, the leading tackler, said he had a coach crush on the Buckeyes linebacker. Daniel, I think that's the exciting thing about here. Comparatively to the last 6 matchups, you can point to individual star-on-star scenarios across the field. No disrespect to the last 6 opponents, but they weren't Ohio State, who recruits the top 5 recruiting class every year. So Ohio State, Penn State, where are you looking individually in this matchup? Kind of where maybe swing the pendulum in one program's favor.
In terms of the one-on-one matchups, I mean, you have to start with Kalen King and Marvin Harrison Jr. I wrote about that Thursday morning on Lions247, and I did make sure to add the caveat that going into last year's matchup, we were expecting a Joey Porter Jr. Marvin Harrison Jr. heavyweight fight, and that never really that didn't really happen. The way that both teams played each other. And I think after the game, I think even Joey Porter Jr. said something along the lines of like, yeah, I thought we were going to see each other a little bit more out there. And it just kind of, didn't happen. So I had to add that caveat in there. But, I think that Penn State did a pretty nice job last year when it came to Marvin Harrison Jr. I mean, 10 catches for 185 is a, pretty eye-popping stat line, but, the game was still close. Harrison, he didn't have a long touchdown catch to really break things off or anything like that. Like
a big compliment,
even with that,
what you're saying to him. I mean, that just speaks to the level of talent. I mean, you're saying did a pretty good job, 10 catches, 185. This guy, he's very highly regarded. I mean, very, very highly regarded.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he moved the chains. He had some big catches, but there was never a moment where it felt like, Marvin Harrison Jr. is beating you. I mean, I looked back and CJ Stroud threw for 354 yards in that game. That was I think it's probably like the quietest 354 that you could see. But I think with Kalen King and Marvin Harrison Jr., I think we're going to see them, line up across from each other. And this is a really big opportunity for Kalen King. And he acknowledged as much. He was very complimentary of Marvin Harrison Jr., just like James Franklin was earlier this week. Kalen King's quote was that Marvin Harrison Jr. just is one of those players that can really do anything out there on the field. And I think, as James Franklin pointed it out, the fact that he's doing it at 6'4" just makes him even more dangerous. But, Kalen King had a quote where he said that, if he wants to get where he wants to go personally, this is the type of game, this is the type of matchup where he needs to step up and really show what he can do. So I think that when you talk about just the straight up, one-on-one offense defense matchups, I think that you start there with Harrison and King. Obviously, I think Marvin Harrison is probably going to see some Johnny Dixon. He might even see some Daquan Hardy, might even see some Cam Miller. I think it's going to be a total team effort on the back end when it comes to trying to stymie Marvin Harrison Jr. a little bit. The health of Emeka Egbuka, the other starting wide receiver, can also play into that a little bit, with how much Ohio State is going to need to lean on him. But, that's where I start right there. And then the other matchup that I highlighted is looking at the pass rushes, on either side. Yeah, I think that when you talk about, how you can neutralize a player like Marvin Harrison Jr., part of it is, you don't even let the ball get to him. You get to Kyle McCord, you force him into bad decisions or throwaways. So I think how the Penn State pass rush, looks compared to the Ohio State pass rush, because that's really what swung the game last year. JT Tuimoloau, came up in just every single big spot pretty much. And that really swung the game. So if Penn State, I think that they probably have an edge in a couple of these individual matchups when it comes to ends and tackles. But if they can, get the game-changing plays this year that Ohio State got last year, I think that that's something too that can really swing a game. I think that Saturday night when we're recording the podcast, we'll look at the sacks column, and I think that there will probably be a correlation to what that looks like versus how the game went.
I think, you have to look at that perimeter because of how it played out and the last time these two teams met and how that derailed everything for Penn State, led to turnovers and led to an Ohio State win. And this year you think, okay, well, Olu Fashanu was in that game last year, but Olu Fashanu at that point had only 6-7 starts under his belt. It's a different Olu Fashanu here, another year of physical development. And then you think about, well, you had Chop Robinson and Diza Isaac in that game last year. I'll take these guys, the versions of them this year. We heard from Chop Robinson yesterday about how much bigger, more powerful he is with 10 added pounds of weight and able to go inside and this 3-man defensive look. I don't know if Chop Robinson could handle that role last year. So there are some familiar faces in this matchup for Penn State, but another year down the line, I think these matchups look pretty good. And on the flip side, Ohio State's play on the perimeter of the offensive line position has been a question mark since they wrapped up last season. People have wondered, how is that going to look when they get to this kind of a matchup? And you look at Josh Simmons, Josh Fryer. Fryer, I'm kind of circling here as someone who seems ripe for the picking if they're able to unleash, a 5 men deep defensive end. And we'll get to our predictions in a second, but that feels like a potential tipping point. Maybe Penn State returns the favor a little bit off the edge from last year. Mark, the head coaches, we just spent a lot of time talking about the players who are going to be in the spotlight, but Ryan Day, James Franklin, no one is going to feel the pressure like those two will entering this matchup. What do you make of the stakes involved for the head coaches on both sidelines?
Let me throw in one more matchup. I think Cade Stover versus, those Penn State linebackers or safeties. I'm not sure how they're going to go out trying to guard him, but that guy's terrific. And I wonder if Penn State won't have benefited from some of the good work they've done with Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren. But yeah, with respect to the significance, I mean, the greater significance is obviously for James Franklin, right? I mean, Ryan Day may have lost a couple of straight games to Michigan, but we see where Penn State's at right now. I mean, they're where they've been, outside of the couple COVID years, the last 4 or 5 years, looking like a New Year's Six team. And how do you take that next step? Well, the next step is winning this game or beating Michigan or winning both, but I don't think you could lose both. So I think from James Franklin talked this week about how they've done a good job. Penn State has done a good job of leveling the playing field, of getting close to one of the elite programs. And I think you can't just be close to an elite program anymore. You have to beat the elite program. So I think Ryan Day has established himself at that slightly higher level. They've been to the college football playoff, but I'm looking at a situation with James Franklin where not just for him, but for the entire program. We've talked about this being the last year of divisional play. So it really matters. I mean, in the future, you could potentially, lose one of these games. And I know it could still happen this year that they could lose and still find themselves back in the Big Ten championship game. But the road in the future will be much easier than it's been during this goofy divisional play. So as I look at this, to me, and maybe it's just because I cover Penn State all the time, I'm not sure what kind of heat Ryan Day's taking, but to me, this is just a big game for James Franklin.
It's been 1,846 days, Mark, since you and I, Daniel wasn't part of the equation yet, sat in that press room and saw as raw of emotion as I've ever seen from a head coach after a game, win or lose. And James Franklin came and gave his Great to Elite speech that I think everyone remembers quite well. It's kind of seared into the brains for Penn State fans. And here we are, all those days later, 5 years later, almost 2,000 days, and he's talking about tangibly seeing that gap filled now. And you can sense that confidence, and you can see it in the fact that Penn State opened as a 4.5-point underdog on the road. That probably doesn't happen in the last several years. But this is the last year of the Big Ten East. And it has been Penn State slotted in as third for a little while now. Felt like Penn State was maybe elbowing with Michigan. Then Michigan rises to prominence, wins that Big Ten championship, and then does it again. And Daniel, look, the Big Ten's going to blow up in a tremendous way next year. I don't know what we're all going to make of it and how many teams are going to get in the playoffs year by year. But Ryan Day, Jim Harbaugh, and James Franklin have been the big players here for the last few years. Prior to that, you had Urban Meyer as the leading member of that group. James Franklin, what do you think it would mean from a national perspective, from a brand perspective, if they get on the plane and they're still unbeaten on Saturday, late afternoon, early evening?
It would be huge. I mean, I think that this would be the signature win for him. I guess we'll have to see how the rest of the year would go to, see how it would compare to the 2016 win. That was obviously a significant win for a lot of different reasons, and that kind of marked Penn State's return to this tier of college football, I guess. But I think that it would just be so significant for Penn State. We talk about where they are in the national landscape, and the rankings and stuff like that. And they've just kind of been on that periphery. It's felt like for most of this year, number 6, number 7, not moving down, that type of thing. But if you get a win here, I think that it vaults you into that top 5 conversation. You'll be in that top 4 conversation when it comes to the college football playoff. But I think that this is really, the way that college football is structured right now. We know all the different ways it's going to change next season, in terms of the realignment with the SEC and the Big Ten, the playoff expanding to 12. I think that, this era, I think that if you're Penn State, you can really, really make your mark on it, by getting a win here, putting yourself in position to win the Big Ten East, which, the whole time that the Big Ten East has existed has just been an absolute gauntlet, and just brutal every year, as we know from watching our alma maters. And then on top of that, you factor into that it's a 4-team playoff. And that I think that, outside of a couple party crashers here and there, it's really been the elite of the elite in college football getting in there. And, and that's where James Franklin wants to be. And so I think that if you're Penn State and you can make a run here, win this game, get yourself in that conversation to be in position to join that club, going into the final 5 games of the season, I think that's really, really significant for the national perception of this program. I think in the future, getting to the Big Ten title game, even after this realignment, it's still going to be hard. It's going to be, I think, pretty brutal, based on the schools that are coming in and the level that they're at. But getting into a 12-team college football playoff, the barrier to entry is going to be a little bit lower. And, it's obviously an accomplishment to be that good and to be in that position, to be a top 12 team nationally, but it's going to have a different sort of cash, I think, when you look at the big picture of things. So, I think that Penn State really does have the chance to put itself in contention to be considered one of these elite programs. James Franklin talked about it, that gap closing between being a top 10 team and a top 5 team. But in order to do that, you got to win games, and that starts Saturday at Ohio State.
Yeah, and both of these programs can say, well, look, we got a little bit of a safety net because you still got a big opportunity with Michigan matchup down the line. And you can maybe, balance things out and put yourself in college football playoff contention. But this is the last year in college football, unless things scale back, and I don't think they ever will again, where it feels like one loss in late October could sink your ship. Your first loss of the season could doom you. And that's always the thing with college football. And James Franklin's talked about it with non-conference scheduling discussions about, do everything you can to stay unbeaten. Let's get into players to watch. We've talked about a bunch of them, but we'll each pick one here before our predictions. And Mark, we begin this one with you.
Yeah, I'm going to dial back to 2015 when Penn State played out at Ohio State in what was generally not a really big game. 38-10 Buckeyes. But the one thing, and it just occurred to me now, that really stood out to me was how smart the Ohio State fans were, because they saw young Saquon Barkley carrying 26 times for 194 yards. He didn't even score, but you could sense in that stadium they were gasping at his runs. Even though their team was blowing out Penn State, it was like they knew how good this guy was. And I think we're going to see that with somebody on the other side of the ball. Not a true freshman, but a sophomore in Abdul Carter. I mentioned it earlier. I think this is going to be a game where he has to play a lot of snaps. I think they're going to ask him to do a lot of things. He's sitting there with 14 tackles on the year. Hasn't had to make many more than that, but he does have some big plays, a sack, an interception, 3 quarterback hurries. I think he's just waiting to bust out. I think this is the kind of stage where he's going to be at his best, and I think he's going to post some big numbers. So, and I also think he's going to be vital to what they're able to do defensively. So I get a feeling that we're going to be out there and we're going to hear some of those oohs and ahs over some of the plays that Abdul Carter makes, because physically he's that kind of guy.
Daniel, your pick?
I'm going to go with Harrison Wallace. I think that we saw a little bit of what he can bring last week against UMass, fumble aside. But I do think that if Penn State is going to win this game, Drew Aller is going to have to make some big throws. And we saw it in that West Virginia game. And we've heard it from players this week that Drew Aller really, really trusts Harrison Wallace. I think that Wallace is going to come up with a couple big catches to move the chains. I think that Drew Aller is going to look to him in those situations. And I think that this is the type of game where you finally see the explosiveness that we've heard so much about with Harrison Wallace in terms of his athleticism. Now, we haven't seen too much outside of that Michigan game last year, I think. But I think that this is the type of game where Harrison Wallace can come up in a really, really big spot, keep this offense on schedule and on the field, and also make some plays himself.
Something to note about Drew Aller's first 2 road starts in Big Ten play, 50% completion. Neither of those matchups involved Harrison Wallace as part of the offensive plan. He was sidelined. So different equation when he's on the field, as we've seen so far. I can't believe you guys are going to let me do this. Daquan Hardy. I mean, we made it 45 minutes into the show. The guy returned 2 punts for touchdowns last Saturday, fellas. I mean, this is a game where if you can, you don't need the touchdown and you take another one, and what an historic trend that would be setting. But if you can get chunk plays out, and I'm looking at him and Caden Saunders, so I guess it's a pairing here. Caden Saunders, I don't think is getting completely shoved to the sideline here, but how can you not utilize Daquan Hardy after what he flashed last Saturday? And James Franklin maybe had some remorse about not doing it earlier in his career. So I think Daquan Hardy / Caden Saunders, if you can find a way to flip the field, turn a situation where you would have started, inside your own 25 to a spot where you're at midfield all of a sudden, or give your defense a chance, or give your offense a chance to take over with possession at the edge of their own red zone. I mean, that could maybe tip the game. I mean, we're talking about that kind of a matchup here. So I think special teams plays a more prominent role in this matchup because of how close we expect it to be. And when you think about the special teams theme right now, I guess I could have gone Alex Falcons, but it's a whole hell of a lot sexier for me to pick Daquan Hardy right now. So I'm going to go Daquan Hardy. Let's get to our predictions and our bold predictions for this one. Daniel, you are first up.
Yeah, coming into the season, I picked Penn State to finish the year 11-1 with their loss coming to Ohio State. I don't know if I'm ready to move off of 11-1 yet, but I don't think that loss, if it happens, will be against Ohio State. And I think that Drew Aller is going to be a big reason why. I think we get that signature Drew Aller performance that we've been waiting for. I think that, maybe Mike Yurcich takes the training wheels off a little bit. The playmakers around Drew Aller show up. And he shows that this is the type of thing that he's built for. The former 5-star quarterback, number one quarterback in the class of 2022, going back to his home state, against a school that didn't recruit him until the very end. And, Drew Aller said this week that, he was locked in 100% with Penn State then. He's locked in with Penn State 100% now. And I think that's going to show up with a career day, more than 325 yards for Drew Aller, which would be a new career high, and 4 touchdowns, which would tie his career high from earlier this year. And I think that leads to a Penn State victory, 31-27 at the Horseshoe.
Daniel, if what you described plays out, I mean, people would sign up for that 1,000 times over a couple of signing days ago when the number 1 quarterback chose Penn State. Wow. That would be quite the message. Mark, what do you got for us?
Yeah, I'll go with my bold prediction to start. I've said it over and over again that I think Mike Yurcich has not showed us all the wrinkles in his playbook, nor should he have showed us all the wrinkles in his playbook. And I think that manifests itself in Penn State, which has had, since Keandre Lambert-Smith's 72-yard catch for a touchdown, I think the longest catch has been 33 yards. I think they go way beyond that. Look early in the game for a 50-plus yard touchdown pass. Could be a tight end, could be a receiver, but I think they take the top off early in this game and have some success. Looking at this game in particular, Penn State's lost 6 straight to Ohio State, but in 3 of those games, Penn State had the outright lead in the fourth quarter. And in a fourth, the score was tied 17-17 in the third. So while this has been a lopsided series score-wise, these have been good games. And I think it's really important that Penn State's in a situation now where you have your head coach and you have both of your coordinators have been here for multiple years. It's been a minute since Penn State's had that luxury. It's been a minute since they've had it with coordinators of this level. you could probably go back to Joe Moorhead and Pry, right? That's from my perspective, with all due respect to everybody else. I think that's going to pay off in a close game. I think that's where Penn State's able to pull this one out, minimizes mistakes. If they make mistakes, I think it's key to put them in the rearview mirror, especially with a guy like Drew Aller. Sooner or later, he's going to throw a pick. Sooner or later, he's going to get, blindsided. Just spit it out and, chew it up and spit it out. But I do think Penn State wins this one 24-20. And before anybody calls us homers, I would just say go and look at our predictions last year, where our entire panel, save one guy who is probably, really the biggest homer that we have on the panel. And it's a contributor, not one of the staffers. We all picked Ohio State, and Ohio State by a wide margin. So I think we're looking at this from a level-headed perspective, but I guess we'll see after the game's over.
Yeah, I picked Ohio State in this matchup last year, and the year before, and the year before, and the 5 years running. I've picked Ohio State in this matchup. It ends today, folks. Well, it ended Tuesday night when I sent it in to Mark, and he got it published at Lions247.com. I'm with you guys, though. I guess I'm drinking the blue Kool-Aid right now, because what we have seen from the six games thus far defensively has exceeded my expectations. I had extremely high expectations for the defense. What they have been able to do up and down the roster over the course of these matchups, regardless of who they're playing, is very impressive. And Manny Diaz, to me right now, he could emerge from this game as the assistant coach storyline across college football. And I think there's been very few years where you look at this Penn State-Ohio State matchup and you say, Penn State could take them to the woodshed a little bit here. And very few matchups. I think that could happen with the defensive front versus Ohio State's offensive front, specifically on that perimeter. Does that mean they need to dedicate more tight end attention to dealing with these edge rushers and chipping guys? And does that maybe detract from what a guy like Cade Stover can accomplish downfield as a pass target? There's a lot of different dominoes, but the biggest one is just making Kyle McCord unsettled. For so much discussion about Drew Aller encountering this environment and being a first-year guy, the first start he made was in front of 110,000 people in a primetime setting on Saturday night. I know it was a nice crowd to him. They weren't booing him or yelling mean things about his mother. He's going to hear that kind of stuff in Columbus. But in my mind, Drew Aller is psychologically fitting that five-star bill. I mean, we have talked so much about his arm talent coming out of high school and so much about the size and the advantageous things that he does for you at 6'5", 240 pounds. But what he has been like psychologically since he got to campus and now through these series of games and just hearing from him this week, I'm buying into him being okay in this situation. I'm not buying into him throwing 4 touchdowns and 350 yards, like Daniel said, and that would be a hell of a thing. I think it's going to be a lot more the same for the offense. Long possessions, keeping Ohio State's defense on the field, that paying off later in the game when the ground game gets going a bit more in the second half. And ultimately, I think the defense is going to make the impact here, getting McCord's face enough, maybe to the point where they force a fumble in a key moment in that pocket late in the matchup. But that when we look back at this and you say, what's the defining factor? It's going to be the Penn State defense making life rough for Kyle McCord on a consistent basis. Penn State wins 27-20, and my bold prediction will kind of just attach right to that defensive performance. I think they'll have at least 3 trips to the red zone, Ohio State, that don't produce touchdowns. So where that means they got to settle for some field goals, if they get aggressive and try to go for it on a 4th down and Penn State comes up with a stop. But I think at least 3 trips to the red zone for Ohio State that don't produce touchdowns, and that ultimately adds up to make the difference here. Guys, you got a great chip lined up, and it's not just about Ohio State, Penn State. Daniel, I know you guys have a segue plan. Tell us a little bit about it, and because I know I want to make sure people check out Lions247.com for the coverage Friday night and the Saturday morning, because once Saturday noon comes, it's an avalanche of game content at Lions247.com.
Yeah, Friday night I'll be heading into the Columbus suburbs from the suburb where I'm staying to check in on Ethan Grunkemeyer, the Penn State commit. Just got a really, really big boost in the 247 Sports recruiting rankings for the class of 2024. He and his Olentangy Braves team have their final regular season game of the year against Marysville. So, I'll be there, intern will be there, and we'll have some, photos and coverage of that. So, if you're up late Friday night, you'll see that on the site. When you get up Saturday morning, it'll be there, and, maybe it'll be something that can tide you over a little bit until we get into that 10 a.m., 11 a.m. Noon spot when things are really going to start to ramp up.
Yeah, before you go watch the current Ohio quarterback, do his thing for Penn State, you can watch the next one and learn more about him from our coverage Friday night into Saturday morning. And Mark, I want to make sure people are aware. It kind of popped up on us this week, but we've got a 60% off deal going on at Lions247.com. It may not be that on fire kind of recruiting week with a home matchup, but those are ahead, most notably the Michigan matchup in November. But big commitment this week. Tyler Calvaruso has a fresh target board update for Penn State regarding the 2024 cycle. And of course, now that we're back in the thick and past the bye weeks and UMasses of the schedule, I mean, this is crunch time and we are locked in.
Yeah, a couple things to remember too. Listen, if you're a monthly subscriber, it makes zero sense to not take this offer and go to annual, because you're going to save yourself a lot of money. And our statistics show that the vast majority of monthlies just over and over and over renew. So you could save yourself a little bit of money by taking advantage of this. Also, at the end of this, at the end of the promotional period, so a year from now, you'll get free Paramount Plus as part of your subscription. And with the Big Ten being more and more and more on CBS, that's going to be more and more and more important as time goes on. And remember, we do a lot of VIP coverage. The vast majority of VIP coverage is recruiting stuff by Tyler and Calvaruso and Doan and everybody. But we also do a lot of VIP team coverage. I mean, practice notes, stuff from games, on location, wherever we go. So it's definitely worth your while to get plugged in. 60% off. It comes out to less than 12 cents per day. It's a good time to jump on board because, if they're able to win, then people will be really ramped up. But we're saying for hardcore Penn State fans, we're billing this as a big game week special. The hardest of hardcore Penn State fans aren't around just for the big game. They're around all year, and you're going to be around all year. So take the plunge, 60% off. You'll save yourself some money and help support the site.
Plus, if they win, we're bumping it up by $5 a month, right? I mean,
Absolutely,
they're 7-0 team that just beat Ohio State. This is we got to pay for the access. No, I'm just kidding, of course, but this is the time. And if there is any kind of opportunity for access to Penn State football coverage, and we mean in the season, out of the season, we will not miss it, which means you will not miss it if you're subscribing. Good stuff from Mark and Daniel, taking the show on the road this weekend to Columbus. You will hear from Daniel and I in a post-game podcast setting, and we'll have plenty to discuss. What we'll be discussing remains to be determined, but it's going to go a long way toward determining the trajectory of this 2023 season. Guys, appreciate the conversation on the podcast. Get there safe, and look forward to your coverage from Columbus.
Will do. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler.
All right. On behalf of everyone here at Lions247.com, I'm Tyler Donahue. We'll catch up with you soon right here in the Lions247 podcast.